Greetings once again. Hope that you're doing well this week. Today I want to introduce you to a short essay by a man who is, without question, one of my favorite authors, perhaps my most favorite author, and that is Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I want to share with you an essay that he wrote, and it was originally published in book form in 1908, entitled On Running After One's Hat. And I want to tell you a little bit about Chesterton, why I love him, why I am constantly reading him throughout the year, why there are certain works by Chesterton that I reread every year. And then I want to share this essay with you and reflect on it briefly and explain why I think it offers a very helpful perspective that I wish I could more consistently maintain in my own life and that I hope might be a blessing in your life as well. Well, Chesterton is, without question, one of the three writers whose work has influenced me more than any other. In fact, Chesterton is on my yearly rereading list. While Lewis may have more volumes on that list that I reread every year, Chesterton's contributions to what I reread every year are no less profound. And in fact, unlike Lewis, who I am reading frequently, I would say that in the case of Chesterton, I'm reading something by Chesterton pretty much continuously throughout the year. It may be a collection of his essays, it may be some of his poetry, it may be some of his more theological or philosophical works. Orthodoxy is one volume that he wrote that I do try to reread every year and have for quite some time. And I will tell you there is probably no other single book that would do more to help you understand how I see the world and might explain some of the differences, even idiosyncrasies in the preaching that I do at Reformation OPC. There might be no other work that could better explain and place in context that preaching and teaching than Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy. Gilbert Keith Chesterton was born in 1874. He died of congestive heart failure in 1936 at the age of 62. He was educated at St. Paul's, but never really went to college. There is some indication that he may have studied briefly at University College in London, but actually he went to art school instead. Didn't really do much there except use some of that training in his later art criticism that he engaged in as a journalist. And really it's unclear if Chesterton's brilliance was to be attributed to the fact that he never went to college. We know that correlation does not equal causation, but certainly this man, one of the brightest lights in the early part of the 20th century, this man demonstrates that it is not a college education that makes a man a great thinker or a great writer, and he left his fingerprints all over Western civilization despite his lack of formal education, or perhaps we should say maybe because of his lack of formal education. He was not placed in the box of education, so to speak, and taught how he ought to see the world. And so I think he, in many ways, saw it far better and more clearly than did many other highly educated people. Chesterton was an Anglican for much of his life. He was converted to Roman Catholicism relatively late in life. He entered the Roman Communion in 1922, and yet you can see the trajectory leading up to that formal conversion even through earlier years of his work. He was a prolific writer. There may be no greater understatement than that concerning any mere mortal. An exact bibliography is difficult to produce, and if you try to find one online, for example, the data, the numbers will vary. He wrote around 100 books, contributed to more than 200 others, wrote hundreds of poems, many poems. The best known perhaps is his epic poem Ballad of a White Horse. There are many others, and they are very good. He wrote 5 plays, 5 novels, 200 short stories, And in fact, many people who are not particularly attuned to nonfiction essays or philosophical writing, social commentary, theology, they might be familiar with Chesterton because of his Father Brown series that has been adapted in public television series as well as in abridged updates for young readers even in modern times. But undoubtedly, Chesterton's most prolific literary work was in his essay writing. He was a newspaper columnist, a journalist for many years, wrote weekly columns for 2 different papers, and published his own paper for quite some time. He wrote roughly 4,000 of these essays. It would, as one biographer noted, it would be like writing an essay every day for 11 straight years, which might prove to be more difficult even than it sounds, and it sounds difficult enough as it is. But not only does Chesterton churn out this massive amount of writing, his writing is consistently insightful. It is substantive. It is, in fact, thrilling and challenging. It will stretch your mind. It will change your perspective. I find him to be a very fruitful thinker, and his thinking to produce good fruit in my own life. Chesterton wrote biographies. He wrote social commentary. He began his career really writing literary criticism and art criticism. He wrote fiction, theology, and philosophy with ease. He moved through all of these genres without formal training in any of them. And it is remarkable how gifted and penetrating his insights truly are. His comments really far surpass many professionals in those genres, and that has even been noted by professionals in those genres. He's considered to have written perhaps the greatest biography in modern times of St. Thomas Aquinas, and his analysis of Charles Dickens is also taken to be truly penetrating and extraordinary, despite the fact that, again, he is not trained in historical study or literary criticism. Chesterton was famously absent-minded. He was constantly writing, obviously, because he's putting out so much, and so he would be found writing in a train station and miss his train quite regularly. He would be writing on the train and not be sure where he was supposed to be at any given point in time. There's one very famous story in which he sent a telegram to his very long-suffering wife, Frances, and said, quote, "Am at Market Harborough, where ought I to be?" And he didn't know. But that makes him only more beloved and appreciated. He was larger than life, both metaphorically and to some extent corporally. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall, weighed in at about 300 pounds. He was jovial, satirical, witty, insightful, and consistently exuded love for and confidence in Christ and his truth. And if it sounds strange for a Reformed pastor to speak in that glowing way about the faith of a Roman Catholic, well, then you and I need to have more conversations about Chesterton. I have profound confidence in his love for Christ, and I think anyone who read him carefully would. Chesterton was one of, if not the most brilliant writer, commentator, and thinkers in the 20th century. There are many other people that obviously would be in that conversation, but there are many intelligent people who would put Chesterton near, if not at the very head of that list. His book, The Everlasting Man, which presents Christianity as the true myth, is an apologetic for the Christian faith, was credited by C.S. Lewis as perhaps the decisive factor in Lewis's own conversion to Christianity after having been an atheist throughout his adult life. No one else wrote with the kind of breadth and simultaneous depth as Chesterton. And I want you to understand this point. There are plenty of writers in the 20th century and prior to that penetrated more deeply into a given topic. You could think of many outstanding theologians, philosophers, who have gone deep into a particular area of study where they have expertise. But you would not look to those same people for all of the different types of commentary and insight that Chesterton has left us with. He writes not only widely, but is able to penetrate deeply across the spectrum of the work that he is doing. You would expect that a man who is writing biography, fiction, literary criticism, art criticism, poetry, philosophy, social commentary, you'd expect that that person would be writing at a very superficial level across all of those various genres and disciplines, but that's not at all what we find. We find that whatever Chesterton puts his hand to in a literary context, he consistently does it as well as, if not in a far superior manner to, the experts in that field. Now, I will say, because I expect that after watching this episode, listening to this episode, many of my friends who might not have read Chesterton, at least not much, are going to be interested in reading him more. I will say that I think Gilbert Keith Chesterton is a little bit more difficult to read than someone like C.S. Lewis. Lewis was greatly indebted to Chesterton, and if you love Lewis, I think you will appreciate Chesterton very much as well. But here is what I would say. It is not that Chesterton is more profound than Lewis. Lewis is certainly profound in his own right. But I think that Lewis's meaning becomes obvious more quickly. Now, perhaps not the full depth of meaning. Lewis rewards careful rereading. And again, I reread more C.S. Lewis books every year than I read anything else except the Bible itself. Lewis is a profoundly deep thinker and an exceptional writer. And so the more times you go back to something by Lewis, the more often you are going to discover new insights and better appreciate insights that you have observed before. But I think that with Lewis, the first time through, you kind of see what he's driving at. You can see the major outlines. And while I would like to say that I think that is also true of Chesterton, I will admit that I am biased. I read Chesterton a lot. And I have encountered many people, including members of my own family, who have read Chesterton and felt fairly flummoxed at the outset, trying to read him and not really sure what this is about. And if that is your experience as you begin to read Chesterton, well, let me say a few things to you. First of all, pick something else up. Chesterton wrote so much and so many different kinds of things that you might find it easier to read something else than whatever you may have picked up at first. Read some of his poetry. Read some of his Father Brown stories. Read, some of his short essays that are satirical and entertaining, thought-provoking, but perhaps are not as sustained and complex an argument as you would find, for instance, in Orthodoxy or far more in The Everlasting Man. So try different types of literature that Chesterton composed. Secondly, I think that Chesterton is difficult in some respects because he is more historically occasioned than some other writers might be. Chesterton is an essayist. He is a journalist. He is writing much of what he wrote prior to World War I, and everything that he wrote long before the rise of Hitler and the onset of World War II. Again, he dies in 1936, And so really, he's not even, Hitler is around, but he's not really in the conversation at the time that Chesterton's life is winding down. And so I would say that Chesterton lived in a world that is a little more far removed from our own, even though it is less than 100 years ago that he died. And so that may make it a little bit more difficult as you're reading these essays where he's referring to things in London, as in the case of the essay that we're going to read this week. Maybe that makes him a little bit more difficult. But if you keep that in mind, if you're aware of that historical context, perhaps it will make him easier to read. The third thing that I would say is what I always say. I say it about the Bible. I say it about C.S. Lewis. I say it about any good work of literature. If you're struggling to understand Chesterton, keep reading and reread whatever it is that you're reading. Good literature rewards rereading, and it would be a shame to pick something up by Chesterton, read it, not immediately understand it, put it down, and never touch one of his works again. Now, Lewis, as we said, is just delightful, and Chesterton, I think, is just as delightful. But I think many of us would say that Chesterton leaves us with a lot of chewing still to do. And so just be mindful of that as you undertake some of his more complex works. Now, what I'm going to read today is the essay titled On Running After One's Hat, and I am reading today out of a collection of his essays. This is a very well-known collection called In Defense of Sanity. You can find this readily available on Amazon. These are essays that are collected from many different works of Chesterton over the years. On Running After One's Hat was originally a newspaper column, a newspaper essay, that was then published in book form in 1908 in a volume titled All Things Considered, and this was where I first encountered it. But if you're looking for just kind of a collection of his essays, this is a good place to start. I would commend it to you. On Running After One's Hat was written at a time when Chesterton was away from London, and he heard about great flooding that had happened in the city, had flooded a number of districts in London, and so he's commenting on that. You will see that that is kind of the historical context of his remarks, but he has a very important point to make before he's done, and so please stay with me until we get to that point. All right. On Running After One's Hat by G.K. Chesterton. I feel an almost savage envy on hearing that London has been flooded in my absence while I am in the mere country. My own Battersea has been, I understand, particularly favored as a meeting of the waters. Battersea was already, as I need hardly say, the most beautiful of human localities. Now that it has the additional splendor of great sheets of water, there must be something quite incomparable in the landscape, or waterscape, of my own romantic town. Battersea must be a vision of Venice. The boat that brought the meat from the butcher's must have shot along those lanes of rippling silver with the strange smoothness of the gondola. The greengrocer who brought cabbages to the corner of the Latchmere Road must have leant upon the oar with the unearthly grace of the gondolier. There is nothing so perfectly poetical as an island, and when a district is flooded, it becomes an archipelago. Some consider such romantic views of flood or fire slightly lacking in reality. But really, this romantic view of such inconveniences is quite as practical as the other. The true optimist who sees in such things an opportunity for enjoyment is quite as logical and much more sensible than the ordinary indignant ratepayer who sees in them an opportunity for grumbling. Real pain, as in the case of being burnt at Smithfield or having a toothache, is a positive thing. It can be supported, but scarcely enjoyed. But, after all, our toothaches are the exception, and as for being burnt at Smithfield, it only happens to us at the very longest intervals. And most of the inconveniences that make men swear or women cry are really sentimental or imaginative inconveniences, things altogether of the mind. For instance, we often hear grown-up people complaining of having to hang about a railway station and wait for a train. Did you ever hear a small boy complain of having to hang about a railway station and wait for a train? No, for to him to be inside a railway station is to be inside a cavern of wonder and a palace of poetical pleasures, because to him the red light and the green light on the signal are like a new sun and a new moon. Because to him, when the wooden arm of the signal falls down suddenly, it is as if a great king has thrown down his staff as a signal and started a shrieking tournament of trains. I myself am of little boys' habit in this matter. They also serve who only stand and wait for the 2:15. Their meditations may be full of rich and fruitful things, Many of the most purple hours of my life have been passed at Clapham Junction, which is now, I suppose, underwater. I have been there in many moods, so fixed and mystical that the water might well have come up to my waist before I noticed it particularly. But in the case of all such annoyances, as I have said, everything depends upon the emotional point of view. You can safely apply the test to almost every one of the things that are currently talked of as the typical nuisance of daily life. For instance, there is a current impression that it is unpleasant to have to run after one's hat. Why should it be unpleasant to the well-ordered and pious mind? Not merely because it is running, and running exhausts one. The same people run much faster in games and sports. The same people run much more eagerly after an uninteresting little leather ball than they will after a nice silk hat. There is an idea that it is humiliating to run after one's hat, and when people say it is humiliating, they mean that it is comic. It certainly is comic, but man is a very comic creature, and most of the things he does are comic. Eating, for instance. And the most comic things of all are exactly the things that are the most worth doing, such as making love. A man running after a hat is not half so ridiculous as a man running after a wife. Now a man could, if he felt rightly in the matter, run after his hat with the manliest ardor and the most sacred joy. He might regard himself as a jolly huntsman pursuing a wild animal, for certainly no animal could be wilder. In fact, I am inclined to believe that hat hunting on windy days will be the sport of the upper classes in the future. There will be a meet of ladies and gentlemen on some high ground on a gusty morning. They will be told that the professional attendants have started a hat in such and such a thicket, or whatever be the technical term. Notice that this employment will in the fullest degree combine sport with humanitarianism. The hunters would feel that they were not inflicting pain. Nay, they would feel that they were inflicting pleasure, rich, almost riotous pleasure upon the people who were looking on. When last I saw an old gentleman running after his hat in Hyde Park, I told him that a heart so benevolent as his ought to be filled with peace and thanks at the thought of how much unaffected pleasure his every gesture and bodily attitude were at that moment giving to the crowd. The same principle can be applied to every other typical domestic worry. A gentleman trying to get a fly out of the milk or a piece of cork out of his glass of wine often imagines himself to be irritated. Let him think for a moment of the patience of anglers sitting by dark pools, and let his soul be immediately irradiated with gratification and repose. Again, I have known some people of very modern views driven by their distress to the use of theological terms to which they attached no doctrinal significance, merely because a drawer was jammed tight and they could not pull it out. A friend of mine was particularly afflicted in this way. Every day his drawer was jammed, and every day in consequence it was something else that rhymes to it. But I pointed out to him that this sense of wrong was really subjective and relative. It rested entirely upon the assumption that the drawer could, should, and would come out easily. But if, I said, you picture to yourself that you are pulling against some powerful and oppressive enemy, the struggle will become merely exciting and not exasperating. Imagine that you are tugging up a lifeboat out of the sea. Imagine that you are roping up a fellow creature out of an alpine crevasse. Imagine even that you were a boy again and engaged in a tug of war between French and English. Shortly after saying this, I left him, but I have no doubt at all that my words bore the best possible fruit. I have no doubt that every day of his life he hangs on to the handle of that drawer with a flushed face and eyes bright with battle, uttering encouraging shouts to himself and seeming to hear all around him the roar of an applauding ring. So I do not think that it is altogether fanciful or incredible to suppose that even the floods in London may be accepted and enjoyed poetically. Nothing beyond inconvenience seems really to have been caused by them, and inconvenience, as I have said, is only one aspect, and that the most unimaginative and accidental aspect of a really romantic situation. An adventure is only an inconvenience, rightly considered. An inconvenience is only an adventure, wrongly considered. The water that girdled the houses and shops of London must, if anything, have only increased their previous witchery and wonder. For as the Roman Catholic priest in the story said, wine is good with everything except water. And on a similar principle, water is good with everything except wine. Well, I hope you enjoyed that essay, as I always enjoy reading it. And I was having to fight as I read it not to laugh at the particular places where I normally laugh when reading that essay aloud to visitors at my kitchen table. Now, I want to go back through the essay for just a moment. Hopefully you recognize the moral of the story, as it were, the lesson that Chesterton is driving at. And we won't spend very long breaking this down. I think the essay speaks for itself. But there are a few things that we could observe. Of course, the historical context are these floods in London, and knowing that no lives were lost, that there was no significant damage perhaps to property, at least that could not be recovered and repaired, Chesterton is offering his readers another perspective on this episode. He is suggesting that since it is only an inconvenience, we ought to consider that inconvenience in a more imaginative way. Now, he recognizes and acknowledges in the second paragraph of the essay that there will be some that think such imaginative perspective is absurd, that it is naive, it is a kind of hopeless optimism that Chesterton is bringing to this particular question. But he says, really, this romantic view of such inconveniences is quite as practical as the other. In other words, there is real practical value in this kind of cheerfulness. Now, I have to tell you that one of the reasons I read Chesterton throughout the year after year, is that I am somewhat jealous of Chesterton and the cheerful disposition that he so clearly has. When you read a biography of Chesterton, you find out that this is not an affectation. This was not merely the way that he presented himself in his literary works. It was, in fact, the man himself. He had a Chestertonian cheerfulness. And Lewis would even describe, by the way, the Puritans in the Reformation period as being themselves Chestertonian in terms of their optimism, largely because the Puritans were postmillennial, and therefore they had this great, robust hope in the lordship of Christ and Christ's victory over all his foes. Well, Chesterton has that same sort of confidence in Christ and joy in his life, even when he's encountering these difficulties. I read him continually because I'm jealous of that disposition, because that is not my natural disposition at all. I am not optimistic. I am by nature very pessimistic and rather prone to discouragement and depression. And so sometimes when I talk to people about Chesterton, or when I read them essays on this very point, such as this one that I just read with you today, I feel almost like a hypocrite, because I have to say that the imaginative, practical perspective that Chesterton is commending and recommending to us is one that I have to fight for and often slips through my fingers day after day. But it is a practical perspective. There is real value in learning to think of inconveniences in this way. Now, Chesterton is clear at the beginning of his essay that he is not trying to deny or downplay real pain and adversity. But he does point out that most of the things that discomfort us, that frustrate and annoy us, are in fact just annoyances. They're just inconveniences. Now, they may be blown out of proportion by our state of mind. We may feel that they are great adversities and hardships that cannot be overcome. But if we could simply detach emotionally, pull back, gain some perspective for just a moment, we might realize that really most of the things we grumble about are not worth grumbling about at all. They are only inconveniences. And this is where a more imaginative and poetical perspective on them can be of such great help. Now, as he begins to develop this theme, he talks about the inconvenience of being stuck at a train station. Well, I don't suppose many of us are stuck waiting for trains anymore, but many of us have been stuck in airports, especially in the last year and a half, when we have resumed traveling to other parts of the country or even other parts of the world, and we have to take a plane. We may find our flights delayed or canceled, our plans changed, and we feel powerless and stuck, as it were, Chesterton says, you hear grown-ups complain about these kinds of things, but have you ever heard a small child, a young boy, complain about being stuck at the train station? As I read this essay every time, I feel a little tinge of sadness, because the truth is, we see that kind of complaining in small children all the time now. At airports, in grocery stores, in all kinds of circumstances where they're being made to wait and they are inadequately entertained. Now let's think about why that is for just a moment. I can remember a time not that long ago when no one had a smartphone in their pocket. No one had an iPad. No one had a laptop that they could pull out of a bag and play a movie or a video game on. And what did we do before we had all of those digital devices? Well, many of us did what some of us still do, and that is carry a paper book, a paperback or a hardback, and a pen and a notebook in a bag, and we would open it up and we would read. And what would small children do at that time? Well, you probably remember, I certainly do. They would stand at the windows and they would watch the planes going out and coming in. They would watch the baggage handlers. They would watch the people that are directing traffic out on the taxiway. They would watch all of the different operations that go into air service. And they would be fascinated by it. And why are we not? Well, because we're too mature to be fascinated with those kinds of things. We're important people. We have important things to do, like watch whatever is on the news or whatever may be playing on the televisions inside the airport. Chesterton has the heart of a child in the very best sense of the term. And I would simply say that as parents today, wouldn't it be great if we could help our children recover some of that magic and wonder? If we want to do that, we're going to need to be prepared to make some hard choices about those digital devices and screens. Well, then Chesterton gets into the very example that gives us the title of the essay. He says there is a popular impression that it is unpleasant to run after one's hat. Well, here again, we see that Chesterton lived in a world very unlike our own, because this was a time when men and women would wear hats out of doors. I would be very happy to recover that time. I have wanted to wear a fedora ever since I was a little boy watching Indiana Jones on the big screen, and I think it would be terrific for fedoras to come back in style so that I could wear one every day without fear of my children being embarrassed. Well, Chesterton says, why should this be thought unpleasant? He says it's not because it's running, because the same people will run in sports. They will run after an uninteresting little leather ball with far more vigor and energy than they will run after a very nice silk hat. He says perhaps because it is absurd, it is comic. And he says, but isn't chasing the young lady that you're interested in, right? When he says make love here, he's not talking about sexual relations. He's talking about wooing her, courting her. And he says we make ourselves ridiculous in that kind of a context. And the act of eating itself, if we could detach and step back and look at it in a new way, we might see the absurdity of it. By the way, this is one of the things that Chesterton will do for you. He will help you think about the absurdity of life, as well as the magic, the mystery, the wonder of life. He will help you see it in ways that you might not have seen it before. He will help you perhaps rediscover things that you recognized as wondrous as a child, but as an adult you have no longer noticed in that way. And then, of course, he is writing somewhat satirically, and so he talks about the sport of hat hunting, the sport of hat chasing that he expects will be instituted in the not distant future, both for sport and humanitarian reasons. I always laugh when he speaks about those irreligious people who, because of modern inconveniences, are moved to the use of theological terms to which they attach no significance. Of course, he's talking about people who will swear in their frustration. He says, a friend of mine was particularly afflicted in this way. Every day his drawer was jammed, and every day in consequence it was something else that rhymes to it. That's the kind of humor that you will find pervasive throughout Chesterton's writings. Finally, we get to the money quote and the real moral and point of the essay in the final paragraph. Let me reread that paragraph and draw your attention to the point that I hope stuck out to you as we read it the first time, and that I hope will stay with you beyond our time together today. He says, "So I do not think that it is altogether fanciful or incredible to suppose that even the floods in London may be accepted and enjoyed poetically. Nothing beyond inconvenience seems really to have been caused by them, and inconvenience, as I have said, is only one aspect, and that the most unimaginative and accidental aspect of a really romantic situation. An adventure is only an inconvenience, rightly considered. An inconvenience is only an adventure, wrongly considered. The water that girdled the houses and shops of London must, if anything, have only increased their previous witchery and wonder." When he talks about the romance of these kinds of moments, of course, he doesn't have in mind the idea of romantic love. He's using this in a more literary way. But the wonder, the poetry, the majesty, the magic of this moment. Learning to look at life and its frustrations and its inconveniences in a poetic fashion. And of course, the key quote in this essay, which is one of many Chesterton quotes that have gotten written on our family whiteboard in our kitchen. We put quotes up there pretty regularly, several times a week, and this one has gone up there more than once or twice. "An adventure is only an inconvenience rightly considered. And inconvenience is only an adventure wrongly considered." It is a matter of perspective, and I want you to think about how life-transforming that perspective might be if it were consistently grasped and applied. Again, we're not talking about real adversity, but we are talking about reimagining, and that in an optimistic and poetical way, many of the types of adversity that we imagine we encounter that are not really as adverse as we make them out to be. How might our lives be changed? How much more peace of mind might we have? How much more peace within our homes might we have? How much more peace in our work? How much more peace in our social relationships? How much more cheerfulness might we have? And at the risk of sounding simply utilitarian, how much better might that be for our marriage, for our parenting, for our health, our physical health, our mental health? It can only improve if we were to incorporate this kind of a perspective into our lives. Now again, we're talking about putting into perspective the petty gripes that we most often have day after day. We're not suggesting that we should poetically reimagine real evil, but we should place even that evil into the broader context of Christ's lordship and purpose. Let me suggest several passages of Scripture that might connect with this theme. There are many others that we could identify, but I pulled out 5 just for our purposes today. First, in Philippians chapter 2, beginning at verse 14, "Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain." Do all things, without complaining and disputing, without grumbling and murmuring, without griping. And yet how often do I? How often do I complain? Well, only on days that end in Y. That's my rule. I only grumble and complain on days that end in Y. On no other day do I dare do so. The reality is, the Bible says, do everything with a contented, grateful, humble, cheerful spirit. And yet most of us don't do most things that way. Don't do a lot of things that way, but do a lot of things, maybe every day, in just the contrary way. It's as if Paul had said, do all things complaining and disputing. While complaining about it, grumble as you work. The Bible says that if we are to be blameless and harmless, children of God without fault, who shine as lights in the midst of a perverse world, well, that involves cutting out the griping, cutting out the complaining. Stop grumbling, stop murmuring. Be grateful, be content. And Chesterton would say, imagine and perceive the poetry and wonder of the things that you were earlier tempted to complain about. The writer James says in James chapter 5 and verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Now, James could mean by that, he is standing at the door, and therefore the things that you grumble about are soon to be remedied, put right. Or he could mean, he's standing right at the door. You don't need to be caught complaining while the Lord is right here observing what you're doing. As if two children are bickering and fighting while dad is standing in the door of their room watching them with displeasure. Either way, James says, don't grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. It's a pretty sobering, strong warning that he brings to us there. Do not grumble. What do we grumble about? Well, we grumble about a lot of things, but Peter maybe points out one of the things that we sometimes complain about. He says in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Do we show hospitality and yet with a grudging attitude? It is unworthy of the name of Christ that we do so. The key in all of this is recognizing the sovereignty of God in our troubles. And to that point, let me take you to Lamentations chapter 3. In Lamentations chapter 3, as the prophet Jeremiah is lamenting poetically the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple of God, he says this beginning in verse 37, who is he who speaks and it comes to pass when the Lord has not commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that woe and well-being proceed? Why should a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search out and examine our ways, and turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to God in heaven. Now that passage we could spend an hour or more easily expanding, expounding, unpacking, and applying. I would recommend that you reread and meditate upon that passage. He simply says, in the midst of this terrible judgment that has been poured out on Jerusalem, has not God done this? And if God has done it, who are we to complain about it? How can we complain when we know that everything that befalls us is appointed by the hand of our God? Now, understand, there is a place for righteous lament. You can even see this in the Psalms. If you're praying the Psalms daily or regularly, singing through the Psalter, you will see that the psalmist speaks of his complaint. But a complaint presented to God in prayer is different than the kind of complaining and grumbling that we're talking about. I hope that distinction is clear. If it's not, let me know. I'll be happy to speak more about it. There's a place to bring a complaint to God in a righteous, humble, faithful way. But Jeremiah says, why should we complain about our suffering when we know that both woe and well-being comes to us from the hand of God? Instead, let us humble ourselves. Let us search out and examine our ways. Let us turn to the Lord and lift up our hearts and our hands to the God in heaven. And then finally, the Apostle Paul, again, Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him, those who are called according to His purpose. He works all things, good and bad, pleasant and painful, joyful and sorrowful. He works all things together for the good of His people. That doesn't mean that all things are good. It doesn't mean that God will make all bad things into good. It means that God will work even bad things together for good. But He will do so not for the unbeliever, not for the reprobate, but for those who love Him, for those who are called according to His purpose. And if we know that, then we have to contemplate that perhaps we are waiting on the train because God is sparing us some great injury that might otherwise befall us, or so that we might have time for contemplation or conversation that we might otherwise never have had. There could be some purpose or benefit for someone else that we will never perceive or know, at least not in this life, that would explain and place in context this inconvenience that we are inclined to grumble about. Perhaps the Lord has appointed that inconvenience to test us, to stretch us, to sanctify us, to make us more like His Son, to turn us back to Him so that we lift our hearts and hands to the God of heaven. Well, of course, these are not possibilities or even probabilities. These are actual certainties. They are promises made to us in Scripture. And therefore, I think Chesterton in that essay is exceedingly helpful to us. I hope that that essay was enjoyable, and more than that it is profitable to you on running after one's hat in All Things Considered and reprinted in Defense of Sanity. I recommend it to you. God bless you. Hope you have a great day.